Social responsibility is the concept that those who have more have a moral duty to help those who have less. Acting in the best interests of society as a whole, rather than in those of a select and privileged group, is embodied at an international level in the governmental foreign aid given to countries suffering crises such as famine and war. At a national level, in the state-provided welfare services funded by its citizens in the form of taxes, such as the NHS, education, and benefits that can be applied for in the event of retirement, sickness, and unemployment. At a societal level, in private organisations such as companies which protect workers' rights and pay fair wages. And at an individual level, in our everyday acts of kindness, support, and compassion towards those who are worse off than we are. J.B. Priestley, in An Inspector Calls, demonstrates the very real and tragic personal consequences of behaving in socially irresponsible ways. Priestley's ideas about social responsibility were underpinned by his own socialist beliefs. Socialism is a political and economic theory of social organisation, which argues that wealth should be distributed more evenly and that people should be treated fairly. Very simply put, this is achieved through the public ownership of the means of production, e.g. factories, and distribution, e.g. the rail system, for the benefit of the state as a whole. Capitalism, on the other hand, is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and distribution and their operation for profit, i.e. individuals are free to buy, sell and distribute goods for their own benefit without the control of the state. For J.B. Priestley, capitalism is synonymous with greed and social irresponsibility and is inextricably bound up with notions of class, as the selfish exploitation of the poor and vulnerable for the enrichment of the powerful perpetuates and exacerbates, or allows to continue and worsens, social inequality. J.B. Priestley grew up in Bradford at the end of the 19th century. He was not poor himself, but was aware of the poverty and social inequality around him. At the age of 20, he enlisted to fight in the First World War, and was greatly affected by what he experienced there. In his autobiographical work, Margin Released, published in 1962, he talks about the way in which the soldiers, who were largely from the working classes, were treated as though they were dispensable commodities by the officers, who were largely from the middle and upper classes. The British command specialised in throwing men away for nothing, the tradition of an officer class, defying both imagination and common sense, killed most of my friends as surely as if those cavalry generals had come out of the chateaus with polo mallets and beaten their brains out. Priestley dramatises this lack of social responsibility, or selfish disregard for human life by those in power, in An Inspector Calls, as Eva Smith is effectively thrown away for nothing, the collateral damage of selfish actions by successive members of the Burling family, and his words here make clear upon whom he places the moral responsibility for her suicide. The Oxford academic Gareth Lloyd Evans has described the play as perhaps the clearest expression made by Priestley of his belief that no man is an island. This is a reference to the writings of Shakespeare's contemporary John Donne, who wrote in 1623 that "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." In other words, we are not separate entities, but are members of the human race. We are, at the end of the day, all in this together. When an individual dies, every single one of us is diminished in some way, because we are all a part of mankind. When the church bell tolls at a funeral, it tolls for us as well, because a part of us has died and reminds us of our own mortality. Priestley takes this concept and with it explores the personal consequences of a selfish and socially irresponsible society. What if we are made to face up to and be held accountable for the consequences of those self-interested acts that we commit on a daily basis, without considering how they might damage others? What if we are made to see how they, as a consequence, damage ourselves? Arthur Burling's views are the antithesis of those put forward by John Donne. In one of his speeches at the beginning of the play, before the arrival of the inspector, he declares that a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself, and his family too, of course, when he has one. And so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. He believes that individuals are islands, that self-preservation is best achieved by concentrating on and taking care of yourself before others. Priestley highlights this idea visually by setting the play in just one room, the dining room of the Burlings' large suburban house, with its good solid furniture that has the general effect of being substantial and heavily comfortable, and where the lighting is pink and intimate. The Burlings are not only enclosed physically in their middle-class bubble, but they are also cocooned psychologically. Completely self-absorbed, they are pleased with themselves, blissfully unaware that their comfort has been achieved at the expense of others less fortunate. The role of Priestley's inspector is to burst that bubble and to metaphorically shine a light on their behaviour, which they have got away with for far too long. Note that Priestley indicates that when the inspector arrives, the lighting should become brighter and harder. Burling's speech continues. But the way some of these cranks talk and write now, you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. But take my word for it, you youngsters, and I've learned in the good hard school of experience, that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. His contempt for socialist ideas here is clear. People who advocate social responsibility are cranks, or eccentric people with odd ideas, and he dismisses the idea of community as all that nonsense. Priestley underlines the importance of rejecting the ideas within this speech by unceremoniously interrupting Burling's pompous lecture with the arrival of the inspector, who, by showing an opposing ideological position, will challenge his complacent and damaging worldview. In his choice of a single victim, the working class and downtrodden Eva Smith, who is successively ill-treated by members of the same family, Priestley dramatically illustrates the idea that the events of our lives and of the lives of everyone around us are a series of chain reactions that are sparked off and affected by our interactions with others. The fact that we are never completely sure that the Eva Smith who lost her job at Burling's factory is the same Daisy Renton who was picked up, ruined and dumped just as quickly by Gerald Croft is deliberate. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. She is simultaneously the three-dimensional, fleshed-out character of Eva Smith, with whom we empathise, as we trace her tragic downfall over a period of about 18 months, and an every woman, a person who is representative of all ordinary women and men, who suffer what Eva suffers on a daily basis, but who are invisible to us. If Burling's anti-John Donne pro-capitalism speech heralds the arrival of the inspector at the beginning of the play, the inspector's pro-socialism speech, the language of which alludes to John Donne's own words, signals his departure. But just remember this, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. As Priestley's mouthpiece for promoting his socialist ideas, note the difference in the language that he gives the inspector compared with that of Burling. Burling's speech contains ordinary vocabulary and has a disjointed feel, what with being punctuated by dashes, as well as being unceremoniously cut off short by the inspector's arrival. By contrast, the inspector's speech has a much more crafted feel, and it is at this point that we can truly hear Priestley's own voice as he addresses the London audiences of 1946 and demands that going forward we all take responsibility for one another. It is powerful and fluent, full of rhetorical flourishes such as emotive language, direct address, antithesis, repetition, and triplets. Especially the striking final one, alluding to the future 2 world wars, the second of which was still painfully fresh in the memories of the play's first audiences, which brings it to a thundering conclusion. As the tragic and pitiful tale of Eva's life and death is revealed step by step, the audience can see that for the older Burlings, the concept of social responsibility is beyond their comprehension. We are introduced to Burling's business ethics and worldview very early on. The way in which he seamlessly transitions from talking about Sheila and Gerald's engagement to a future merger of his company with Lord Crofts with the ultimate goal of lower costs and higher prices in the space of one speech tells us a lot about him. Not only does he see the engagement as less a romantic match and more a strategic business move, but we can also see that his business model has no regard for the people upon whom his wealth rests, i.e. his workers. Burling is a capitalist, and for him, maximum profit precludes notions of social responsibility, because that would necessarily mean paying his workers more. Manufacturing at this time was much more dependent on manual labour than it is now. So for Burling, lower costs just means paying his workers less, while keeping more of the money for himself. The irony, of course, is that the higher monetary prices to which he aspires means that his workers also end up paying a higher price in terms of their struggle to survive. He styles himself as a hard-headed businessman who talks dismissively of the miners who came out on strike demanding better pay and conditions, reassuring his family, "Don't worry, we've passed the worst of it. We employers at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected, and we are in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity." Burling's language in this speech reveals much about his worldview. Everything is from his own perspective as an employer. Note the way in which he uses the personal pronoun we here to refer to a very narrow range of people. By we, he does not mean everyone. He means employers or capitalists like him, ganging up on the working classes to feather their own nests. It is only a time of steadily increasing prosperity for the middle and upper classes. The working classes are not deemed relevant and, as we later see, have not reaped any of the benefits of this. In fact, in this society, as the rich get richer and more powerful, the poor get poorer and more marginalised. Burling shows no remorse for his behaviour and refuses to take accountability for what has happened to Eva. Still, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? His complete lack of comprehension of the consequences of his dismissal of Eva Smith is shown in his choice of the inappropriate word awkward, which trivialises not only her death, but her entire life. He continues, "We'd all be in an impossible position, wouldn't we?" The use of the words can't and impossible and the rhetorical question here demonstrates Burling's inability to imagine a different future, or even to entertain a different way of behaving. Both Sheila and Eric show an embryonic theoretical awareness of social responsibility in the early stages of the play, however, even if their actions towards Eva in the past reveal that up to this point they have not had the capacity to demonstrate it in practice. They both react angrily when they find out how Burling treated Eva, with Eric challenging his father, "It isn't a free country if you can't go and work somewhere else," and Sheila calling his actions mean and a rotten shame and recognising that these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. When Sheila observes to the inspector, "You talk as if we were responsible," she is less challenging him than questioning her own understanding of her actions. It's not something that she's ever had to consider before. As growing up in a comfortably off family and never having had to work, she's been kept in quite a cocooned state, especially as politics at this time was not considered a suitable subject for women to be engaged in. She's a quick learner, however, and she soon starts speaking for herself, distancing herself from her parents in the process, as she is able to make the causal links between their behaviour and the effect that it has on other people that her parents seem unable to. Father threw this girl out because she asked for decent wages. I went and pushed her father out right into the street, just because I was angry and she was pretty. In the same way that John Donne goes on to argue that the awareness of others' pain only makes us stronger and more able to live, the younger characters actually find the concept of sharing responsibility very liberating and empowering. The inspector is very clear that he wishes Sheila to remain in the room to hear the rest of Eva's story in order that she learn from it, as, for the inspector, social responsibility is all about collective responsibility. Now Miss Burling has just been made to understand what she did to this girl. She feels responsible. And if she leaves us now and doesn't hear any more, then she'll feel she's entirely to blame. She will be alone with her responsibility the rest of tonight, all tomorrow, all the next night. Sheila and Eric's willingness to hold themselves and the other members of their family to account continues even after the inspector has left, as they feel able to criticise not only themselves but also their parents. Sheila, for example, says to her parents, "If you want to know, it's you two who are being childish, trying not to face the facts." And Eric challenges Gerald's assessment that it may have all been nonsense with, "I don't see much nonsense about it when a girl goes and kills herself. You lot may be letting yourselves out nicely, but I can't, nor can Mother. We did her in all right." Sheila has, in fact, come such a long way that after the inspector leaves, she takes over the role of Priestley's mouthpiece, repeatedly reiterating the way in which all of the Burlings' actions are connected. While Priestley uses the character of Arthur Burling to illustrate exactly what he thinks is wrong with the way in which employers treat their workers, he uses that of Sybil Burling to highlight the pitiful organised charity that Eva tries to access. The welfare state was still in its infancy in 1912, and there was little aid for those who had fallen on hard times, with the workhouse system only abolished in 1930. It is clear that Mrs. Burling's work on the committee of the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation, which gives out small amounts of money to the very narrowly defined, deserving poor, is nothing but paying lip service to ideas of social responsibility. Mrs. Burling is complacent as she congratulates herself on the fact that we've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases. The fact that throwing herself on the committee's mercy is Eva's very last resort, rather than her first recourse, demonstrates the degradation and humiliation that came along with begging for money from the rich and powerful. Mrs. Burling uses her position as the most prominent member of the committee to prejudice their decision not to give Eva financial help. While Mr. Burling is proud of being a hard-headed man of business, Mrs. Burlings seems to be proud of being a hard-hearted woman of charity, reserving her feelings of outrage for what she perceives to be her own bad treatment at the hands of Eva Smith, who commits the heinous crime of calling herself Mrs. Burling. Mrs. Burling admits that she influenced the committee to refuse the claim because she didn't like her manner, and that her piece of gross impertinence, quite deliberate, was naturally one of the things that prejudiced me against her case. Mrs. Burling's use of language here is very interesting. The use of the word deliberate to describe Eva's unfortunate slip is indeed evidence of her prejudice to think the worst of her, something which she feels is only natural. Her lack of shame here reveals her innate belief that her superiority is untouchable. In order to act in socially responsible ways, we need to feel empathy for other people, and in order to achieve this, we need to perceive them as being as human as we ourselves are. The inspector acknowledges this difficulty when he observes to Sheila, "In fact, I've thought that it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these young women, counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms." The older Burlings are prejudiced against the poor because they are unable to put themselves in their place. They dehumanise them, immediately blaming them for the negative things that happen to them. In their eyes, they demand things that they have no right to demand, as they do not have the right to speak up for themselves, and they are not permitted to possess any morals. Neither Mr. Burling nor Mrs. Burling feel empathy for Eva Smith, as they are only able to see things from their own perspective. For Mrs. Burling, Eva had only herself to blame, and in Mr. Burling's eyes she is a wretched girl, the news of whose suicide has disturbed the celebration of Sheila and Gerald's engagement. He says, "We were having a nice little family celebration tonight, and a nasty mess you've made of it now, haven't you?" The inspector uses these selfish remarks against him when he answers back, "That's more or less what I was thinking earlier tonight, when I was in the infirmary looking at what was left of Eva Smith. A nice little promising life there, I thought, and a nasty mess somebody's made of it." The juxtaposition of the inconsequential nasty mess of a family party with the horrifically tragic nasty mess of Eva Smith's life enhances our sense that callous Mr. Burling really has got his priorities completely wrong. Priestley seems to place all his hopes for a socially responsible future in the hands of the young. With his characterisation of Sheila and Eric, he seems to be saying that our natural inclination is to look out for one another and to help one another, shown by the pair's emotional responses to their father's treatment of Eva Smith early on in the play, and that being selfish and acting in our own interests, demonstrated by the older Burlings, is an unnatural inclination which we acquire, either learning it in the good hard school of experience, or through a sense of entitlement with which we are conditioned as a result of our upbringing, as in the case of the socially superior Mrs. Burling. Indeed, the early warning signs are there, in that the way Sheila treats Eva Smith at Millwards foreshadows the way in which her mother treats her in front of the charity committee. Both are offended by her manner. Sheila's vanity and Mrs. Burling's pride are pricked, and both strike out using the limited power that is at their disposal as women at this time. There is a sense that without the intervention of the inspector to show her the very real consequences of socially irresponsible actions, the Sheila of today, using her position as the daughter of a wealthy local businessman to get a poor shopgirl sacked, is the Mrs. Burling of tomorrow, using her position as a prominent member of a committee to get charity refused to a vulnerable pregnant woman in dire straits, leaving her with suicide as the only viable option. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques, and English literature texts.